America is opening up relations with Cuba, and it's a big deal, ending decades of hostility and beginning a new era between the two countries. But to understand just how big of a deal, where that hostility really came from, why it took so long to end, you've got to go back, way back. Not to the 1950s, as many Americans might think, but to the 1850s. The story starts with America divided between pro-slavery and anti-slavery politics, and one of their many fights is over the Spanish colony of Cuba. Pro-slavery lawmakers want to buy Cuba from Spain, or take it by force to turn it into a new slave state. Anti-slavery politicians oppose this, calling it imperialism. But fast forward to 1898, after slavery's over. Americans have a different version of this same argument when Cubans rise up against Spain. The U.S. joins them, starting the Spanish-American War. But Americans divide. Should the U.S. seize Cuba from Spain for itself, or liberate the island? This is part of a much bigger debate at the time over whether the U.S. should explicitly become a European-style imperial power. So this is an argument about Cuba, but it's also an argument about America, what kind of country it should be. Should America be the kind of country that controls Cuba, or that respects it as a fellow sovereign nation? And that argument has continued in different forms ever since. At this point, in 1898, that fight happens in Congress. Each side passes laws trying to force their way. And it ends up with a weird split baby policy, with Cuba winning independence, but other quasi-imperial American rule. The U.S. would take over Guantanamo Bay, dictate Cuba's foreign policy, and give itself the right to intervene in Cuban affairs. Then came the American interventions in Cuba in 1906 and 1917. Each time, the U.S. military takes over for a few years, ostensibly to resolve some political crisis, but that usually means protecting American interests, such as sugar imports. Today, when Americans think about the U.S. and Cuba, we think of the Cold War, but Cubans often think back to this imperial era. And that era technically ends in 1933 with an uprising against Cuba's government. Under U.S. law, America is supposed to intervene again, but President Franklin Roosevelt wants to end the imperial era, so he declares neutrality. And over the next 20 years, Cuba becomes a democracy, and one that's generally friendly with the U.S. That changes in 1952, when a former president and military leader named Fulgencio Batista seizes power in a coup, suspends the Constitution, and imposes an increasingly oppressive rule. Cuba's communist uprising begins the next year, led by a young Fidel Castro. American politics at this point is obsessed with fears of communism, so the U.S. backs Batista in the war, no matter how brutal he becomes. But for Americans, this feels like a front in the struggle against communism. But for Cubans, it feels like Batista is an extension of American imperialism, and the guerrilla war a continuation of their long fight for freedom. Now, the communists win in 1959 and Castro takes power. The U.S., fearing communism's expansion, sets up the embargo to strangle Cuba's economy, tries to assassinate Castro, and even, in the disaster known as Bay of Pigs, sends in CIA-trained Cubans to try to take over the island. Castro turns to the Soviets for help, and in 1962 they nearly start World War III when the U.S. blocks Soviet efforts to put nuclear missiles in Cuba. The incident scares everyone enough that things settle into a tense but basically peaceful status quo. Over time, ordinary Cubans are squeezed between the U.S. embargo and Castro's dictatorship. In 1980, Castro tries to relieve some political dissent by briefly allowing Cubans to leave the island, and 125,000 arrive in Florida. No one realizes it at the time, but this adds a completely new dimension to the conflict. It's now also about the internal Cuban battle between Castro versus Cuban dissidents, which plays out through American politics. And this becomes really important in the 1990s. After the Soviet Union collapses, President Bill Clinton, seeing Cuba poses no threat, wants to end the conflict. So does Castro, who can't count on Soviet aid anymore. But Cubans in America, who suffered terribly at Castro's hand, want to see him fall and push for keeping the embargo. In the middle of this fight, in 1996, Cuba shoots down 2 private planes chartered by Cuban-American activists. There's a big backlash in the US, and Clinton backs down. 20 years later, President Barack Obama tries again to end the conflict. By now, Americans don't really support the embargo. Lots of Cuban Americans are now economic migrants rather than political exiles, so they want openness. Fidel is getting old, and in 2008 hands power to his brother Raul, who knows the country needs to change. The US and Cuba start secret talks in 2013. The new Pope, Francis, helps negotiate. In 2014, they reveal their agreement to end the conflict, and the next year, Obama becomes the first president to visit since Calvin Coolidge in 1928. The US and Cuba have never really had normal relations until now, and that's crucial to understanding why it took so long for this to happen. So much has passed between the two countries over the past century, and the US has at times treated Cuba as more of a colony than it's a real country. It's a lot to get over, but it looks like they might both finally be ready.
Thank you. Muchas gracias. Havana is only 90 miles from Florida. But to get here, we had to travel a great distance over barriers of history and ideology, barriers of pain and separation. The blue waters beneath Air Force One once carried American battleships to this island to liberate, but also to exert control over Cuba. Those waters also carried generations of Cuban revolutionaries to the United States, where they built support for their cause. And that short distance has been crossed by hundreds of thousands of Cuban exiles on planes and makeshift rafts, who came to America in pursuit of freedom and opportunity, sometimes leaving behind everything they owned and every person that they loved. Like so many people in both of our countries, my lifetime has spanned a time of isolation between us. The Cuban Revolution took place the same year that my father came to the United States from Kenya. The Bay of Pigs took place the year that I was born. The next year, the entire world held its breath, watching our two countries as humanity came as close as we ever have to the horror of nuclear war. As the decades rolled by, our government settled into a seemingly endless confrontation, fighting battles through proxies. In a world that remade itself time and again, one constant was the conflict between the United States and Cuba. I have come here to bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas. I have come here to extend the hand of friendship to the Cuban people.